Hey, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today. I am Flo, and I work within the Policy Profession Unit. Today, you'll be participating in the knowledge series Stakeholders as a System with Jonathan Morris, who is the Head of Future Energy and Water Systems at the Infrastructure Planning Service, London Borough of Tower Hamlets. We would like to encourage you to share your comments, ideas, and post questions in the chat. For the questions that are posted in the chat, please do upvote the ones that you would like answered, and we will be prioritizing this. If you would like to enable captions, please go to the three-dot icon and a drop-down menu will appear with an option to do this. Please can I ask everyone to remain muted with your cameras turned off unless you're requested to turn them on. Finally, towards the end of the session, we will be sending a feedback form, which we would appreciate you completing as it will help us shape future sessions. Now, to begin the session, I will hand over to Jonathan. Thank you.
So yes, Jonathan Morris is my name. I'm the head of the Future Energy and Water Systems team at Tower Hamlets, and I'm here to talk to you today about stakeholders as a system. But before I do, I'll just give you a bit of background around who I am and where I've come from. So I'm a town planner and have been a town planner for about 20 years now. I've been working in infrastructure planning for 12 years in local authorities. 3 of those 12 years I've spent planning heat networks at a strategic level. I have undertaken the policy fellowship course at the Royal Academy of Engineering, and you'll see there my policy challenge was all about maximizing social value from heat networks. So essentially, yes, how do you use systems thinking to tackle this complex policy problem? So the purpose of today, so I will be using the vehicle of heat networks for today's learnings to better understand stakeholders as part of a system. And I'll be talking about key learning points on, being outcomes-led, being empathetic to stakeholders, and being proactive to dealing with conflict. I should also say I can't profess to be an expert in stakeholder engagement, but I've learnt a few things from my experience thus far, which I'd like to share with you. So why heat networks? Well, the Climate Change Committee, who advises central government on how to achieve its net zero 2050 carbon emissions target, has confirmed that heat networks are the cheapest way to decarbonise domestic heating. Okay, so what's a heat network? Well, put very simply, it's 2 pipes laid in the ground between a heat source and heat users. One pipe takes hot water to heat homes in this particular case, that you can see. Water then releases the heat, and the other pipe returns the cold water to the heat source to repeat the cycle. So what are some of the risks for local authorities? Well, it's a previously unregulated industry, which has often led to heat outages occurring on existing heat networks, poor service, somewhat negative narratives, especially in Tower Hamlets, and they can require billions of pounds to deliver at scale. Therefore, it needs coordination between public and private sector investors. However, if the private sector is left by itself to plan and deliver, then there's a risk of them cherry picking the most viable areas and excluding other areas, such as perhaps maybe social housing, as an example. And this is an issue for us if we want to be realizing social benefit, because these are the people who need cheap heat the most, which heat networks, we understand, should be able to deliver in future. Another really, really big risk for councils is the fact that some have actually gone bankrupt delivering, owning and operating heat networks. So there is a significant commercial risk here as well. So I will just quickly pause here if there are any questions about this slide thus far. No questions? Okay, I'll proceed. Right, so what can councils do in this space? If we, as a council, want to minimise our commercial risk, then we need to rely on private heat network providers to fund, build and operate heat networks. But then we're working in a space where councils inherently won't have direct control over delivery. Therefore, councils must wield their influence on this process to ensure the public's interest is prioritised and social value can be maximised as a result. But we can only do this if we have a seat at the table. So the first thing we can do is get a seat at the table, which means playing an active role in the planning and delivery process for heat networks. Once you have a seat at the table, you can then build relationships with stakeholders, build rapport, build trust, and then hopefully get their buy-in. This will enable councils to maximise benefits for local people and ensure local politicians are appropriately engaged. And even if we don't have direct control over delivery, councils can then still provide, nonetheless, a leadership role of bringing stakeholders together to pull towards a common goal. Right, easier perhaps said than done. So how do we actually go about doing this in reality? Well, I would say the first thing to come to mind would be being outcomes led. And the first question to ask here is, who are the end users? Who experiences the real world outcomes day to day? We need to identify who they are. We need to engage with them to understand what outcomes they want to see. And we can then use their views to develop critical success factors at the project start point, and also take input from other stakeholders' views to develop those critical success factors, to then guide the projects and then help inform decisions throughout the project's life cycle. So what are critical success factors? Well, these are factors best developed at the start of a project. You can then use after you've completed it to understand whether or not it's been a success. These are different to project objectives in that they sit under objectives and set out the conditions for what succeeding and delivering those objectives looks like. If you do all of this and understand what drives the end users, you can talk a language most of your stakeholders will understand, because the end users are the consumers, the customers, the residents, the constituents, the voters, and possibly even saboteurs of your project if you don't get it right. So we shouldn't underestimate them. And it's best not to assume we know what they want or what their desired outcomes are. So I can appreciate this can take a lot of time and resource, but please treat it as an investment, because this will pay dividends, I think, at the end of a project, because the more time spent engaging with and understanding end users at the start means avoiding the much greater amount of time and money one might need to spend at the end trying to fix the otherwise avoidable problems that will arise. So this is going to require more than just sending out a public survey. Instead, think about more interactive ways to engage. Having feedback on outcomes from end users is absolutely key and may even make the difference between whether or not a project is successful in its delivery. So a question to you, do you know who your end users are? And I'll pause here. And actually, maybe I'll just move on to my example first. So here is an example within our borough of an unsuccessful heat network planning and delivery system, where we had a housing estate connected to an existing heat network that was installed 15 years ago. It was a very poor quality installation done cheaply, and it's now failing end users, which in our case are our residents. There are severe heating and hot water outages resulting in an intermittent heat supply over several years now. The original installer has now gone bankrupt, but the heat obligation still sits with the estate owner. The network now has a completely new provider, and they're trying their best to resolve the situation, but it is complicated and challenging. So the council doesn't own the network or the estate, but I was made aware of the situation through one of our officers who lives there and alerted me to the situation. He advised me of the impacts on himself, his family, and his neighbours, and how their heating needs were not being met, which completely undermines the purpose of a heat network. So even though we as Tower Hamlets were not responsible for this situation, I, as the FUSE team, Future Energy and Water Systems team, wanted to understand how I could use residents' feedback to better inform the design of successful heat network systems and develop critical success factors to avoid this situation arising on other projects and ensure the delivery of more positive and desirable outcomes in future. So yes, these residents really cared fundamentally about having access to affordable and reliable heat that just works all the time. Unfortunately, this incident has happened primarily because the sector's been an unregulated one, where providers were free to deliver poor quality outcomes at the cheapest cost to maximize profits over the short term. So this situation stresses the importance of having mandatory technical design, operational and performance standards for heat networks providers to build and operate to at a minimum. Helpfully for us, such mandatory standards will soon be adopted by Ofgem, who've just been announced as the heat network regulator now. And these standards align quite nicely, actually, with the issues raised by residents. So we can use them along with the critical success factors to drive positive outcomes for our residents across the borough. These new standards will force the provider to improve the network to ensure a higher quality service. And I can refer to these upcoming standards when I'm trying to reassure other stakeholders across the borough, such as other residents, consumers, local politicians, and investors, that poor performance in the past will not necessarily equal poor performance in the future. Heat networks can deliver positive outcomes for residents. And there are other positive examples I can refer to elsewhere in London. These regulatory requirements will create more confidence, trust in the sector for investment. So I will pause for any questions. Flo?
Yes. So this question says, how do you engage with people who either don't care about the project but will be impacted, or people who don't trust public bodies?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think you have to use your local politicians who will have their ear to the ground around, what they essentially see and want to deliver for their environments and then for their constituents. So yeah, it's a really, really good question. Getting the attention of those who perhaps don't want to engage. I think maybe you need to frame it and couch it again in a language that they're going to understand. So, if you want to engage with people, you need to really stress what the benefits are. So if I was engaging a resident, they're like, yeah, I just don't really care. And I said, oh, okay, well then how much are you paying, I don't know, on your gas boiler at the moment? Is that affordable to you? Do you want that to continue in future? Do you want to be exposed to international fossil fuel markets? And if all the answers to those questions are, well, no, do you have a better alternative? And I would say, well, actually, yes, I do. Heat networks are able to provide heat that, can be eventually a cheap source of heat, a resilient, robust source of heat that's entirely insulated from the cost of fossil fuels, so long as you're using localized homegrown heat, for which there are many range of waste heat sources across the country and across the city. So again, it's talking to them in a language that they're going to resonate with, which again, I'll come to in my next example. Do we have another question?
Yes. So we have one here that says, how do you know you've considered all the stakeholders and or end users?
I suppose you don't really. You can always be doing more engagement with as many stakeholders as you can. But I guess at the end of the day, you do have to draw a line on the amount of resource that you have. But I think you need to ensure that you get a good spread of the residents from different neighborhoods, end users from different environments. So we have in Tower Hamlets, one of the largest spreads of socio-economic demographics in the entire country. So I, in Tower Hamlets, would be wanting to target, individuals from each of those communities to ensure I've covered as many bases as possible. Because from our perspective, heat networks, we know, are going to play a really key role in decarbonising our borough, right the way across the borough, whether it be for more deprived areas or more affluent areas. So yeah, you can always do more engagement, but you need to ensure that you've identified all of the groups that you feel are going to be impacted. And again, I'll come to more information about that as we progress through the presentation. Next question.
Thanks, Jonathan. So the next one we have here. Sorry, I'm just going to go to this one because it's about this slide. You mentioned standards. Are these actually regulations or BSI created?
So they are actually currently not regulated for, but will be once the heat network zoning regulations land later this year. So yeah, they are minimum standards that will have regulatory weight. So therefore, not complying with these standards with an appropriate time frame. So for example, existing heat networks will be given, I think, roughly until about the end of the decade, to ensure that their heat networks are up to standard. And that will be, effectively a requirement as soon as the heat network zoning regulations come into effect later this year.
Thanks, Jonathan. Do you have time for one more?
Sure.
Yeah. So, do you consider each end user in isolation or in combination? In your example, would you have a separate stakeholder systems map for businesses?
Yes, I mean, this isn't a fully comprehensive, stakeholder map of all stakeholders that are impacted by the heat networks system. The reason for that is I just didn't want to clutter up the screen too much. But no, I mean, I would definitely consider all stakeholders as one map for which residents provide a crucial component as end users. However, the weight that I would give upon the end user's views would be substantially more, because fundamentally, from a local authority's perspective, the end users are our residents and our voters. And again, I'll come to an example later on whereby nothing happens unless you have that political buy-in. So therefore, without the end users and their views and their votes for our politicians, the whole system falls over. So again, I'll come to that in more detail in a future example I'm going to share with you. Okay, so I'll move on, Flo.
Yeah.
Right, so being empathetic to stakeholders, fundamentally, we need to be asking ourselves, what is it that drives stakeholders? Can you identify all of their interests? And if you can't, you need to find out. It may be just as simple as actually being quite direct with them and asking them, what their interests are. But we also need to understand what their barriers are to participation. And sometimes they might not always tell you what their interests are either. So you will have heard the adage, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. So this is what you need to do with stakeholders, to try to understand their perspective. And once you have a bit of insight into what their perspective is, you can then figure out what your projects can offer them and how it can actually add value to them. We need to paint a picture of the opportunity, and we need to tailor our messaging to do this so that it resonates with them. We need to be asking the right questions, not only of them, but also of ourselves. But how do we know what these are? Because you don't always know what you don't know. So seeing things from their perspective is important to understand what other questions you might want to be asking are. Hopefully, some of you will have done the Policy Fellowship course. Within that, they actually talk about employing a critical friend or an expert from the industry. We've done this, not necessarily specifically in heat networks, but in other tricky, wicked, or should I say, problems of a wicked nature, to get a critical friend or an expert in order to be able to bounce our thoughts off, and then also be able to ask them questions so that we can better understand what stakeholders' perspectives might be as well. So asking the right questions, I'm going to take you through another example whereby we have a large housing developer or an estate owner within our borough, who's committed to a 2035 net zero target using heat pumps. Unfortunately for us, heat networks at a strategic scale are less likely to be delivered in Tower Hamlets by 2035 in their area. So why would they want to connect to a heat network if they're already on track to hit their 2035 net zero target? But am I actually asking the right question here? Because being empathetic to our stakeholder, we need to understand what fundamentally drives them as a large, highly successful housing developer. Well, I know that heat pumps have higher costs than heat networks to run, and they also need to be replaced every 15 years. Could it be that a heat network presents a more commercially attractive proposition? Does one have to be mutually exclusive to the other, or could the two work well together simultaneously? If you connect a building's heat pump to a heat network, that building can sell surplus heat back to the network during off-peak times. And when the heat pump comes to the end of its life, you won't need to replace it because you can operate heat networks more cheaply. So you now don't have the higher costs of running it either. Removing the heat pump will also make space on the roof for more solar panels to provide even greater returns. And the heat network is now the cheaper means of maintaining a zero carbon solution. So having understood all of this, we met with a housing developer to discuss and champion the economic case rather than just the environmental one for a heat network connection. And we actually were able to persuade them to consider a connection as soon as possible. So we now have their full attention, and they are set to make a significant contribution towards advancing our shared agenda. Flo, are there any questions there that you wanted to put to me?
Yes, I think this question ties perfectly with this slide. So it says, do you have any tips on getting comprehensive input from stakeholders, especially when they're very focused on a particular area and they keep returning to that one area when we're trying to get input on a range of issues?
Right, yes. I suppose you have to come back again to the benefits to them of participating in your project, and that those benefits will not be realized unless all of these other issues are addressed. So whilst they may only want to focus on, I don't know, say the commercial bottom line, which is going to be their priority, you need to be quite clear to them that, look, these other issues are not going to go away. They need to be resolved in order for there to be a successful outcome here. So I think that needs to be made really clear. And I think, again, it's about spending the necessary time to be able to get the engagement that you want from them. So, having an introductory session to introduce the project to them is obviously not going to be enough. I think if you're able to build trust over several engagement sessions and rapport, then hopefully that's going to give you, an open door to be able to discuss all of these other issues, and that they will then trust that your judgment around these issues, that they need to be, that these issues need to be resolved, will hopefully bring forth their participation and engaging on those issues. Next question.
Yeah. So, what is different in the stakeholder management when taking a systems approach?
Sorry, compared to another approach. Well, I suppose it's being able to understand how looking at stakeholders as a system, I think enables you to be able to far easier identify what the common interests might be between all the individual stakeholders. If you just consider each stakeholder on a stakeholder by stakeholder basis, you're not going to be able to draw parallels, I think, as easily, because doing a systems map in the first instant means you don't just identify the stakeholders, but you identify their interests and who those interests then might be linked to other stakeholders. How those interests might then be linked to other stakeholders as well. And you might have multiple different stakeholders that have those common interests. So again, being able to get buy-in means that you need to focus on those interests first and foremost. And I think as well, I'll come to how you might manage conflicts of interest shortly too. But yeah, thinking about a system enables you to identify interests, identify benefits far easier than what you would if you just used a siloed approach, really. Next question.
We have one here that says, how do you avoid bias when you have a set outcome in mind?
Well, this is a good question. And I would say that the bias, first and foremost, should be towards the public's interest, absolutely first and foremost. And there are actually few stakeholders, I think, when it comes to delivery at the more local coalface level, that actually have the public's interest prioritized, which is why it's so important, I think, for local authorities to be involved in the planning and delivery of projects that are for fundamentally the benefit of the public. So yeah, by having local authorities leading on that, then means that you're not going to be having one private interest, prioritized over others or biased in that sense. So yeah, it's a challenging situation, I think. But yeah, always come back to what are the benefits to the end users, and if those are the public, well, then the public's interest needs to be prioritized, and there needs to be somebody that's in a leading role that's able to advocate for those interests. Next question.
We have one more here that says, do you have a template for systems thinking stakeholder map?
Not at my fingertips. I'm sure if you were to contact the Royal Academy of Engineering, that they would be able to provide you with one. But also you can just simply go on to onto the internet and just simply type in stakeholders as a systems map, and they'll show you how to do systems mapping for which stakeholders is a part. It's not complicated, but it forces you to think outside of your everyday silo and consider all of the players that are needed to deliver your project and plan it appropriately.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's all we have for right now.
Great. Right, so being proactive when dealing with conflict. So I talked about identifying interests, but we also need to be able to identify where interests may conflict. And where they conflict, take early proactive action to minimize the impact that that conflict might have. We need to be setting up dedicated meetings with each party to understand each of their perspectives. We need to listen carefully, build trust, invest time to work through it. Need to be focusing on interests, not starting positions to find common ground. Again, your stakeholder systems map should really help with that. And where possible, we need to be able to manage the messaging too. So I'll give you an example of that. Here we have a set of stakeholders for what a successful heat network planning and delivery system might look like. You'll probably recognize this from before, but with a few changes. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner, I've inserted our lead cabinet member, who as a councillor is our portfolio holder and policy decision maker. An equivalent example for yourselves might be, I don't know, say the Secretary of State. And I'm also going to use the previous example of what happens when one part of the system fails and how you might want to minimize the risk of the whole system falling over when you consider not just this heat network, but the wider system of heat networks at a strategic level. So even though this network is not owned by the council, the situation of intermittent heat supply still poses a serious strategic risk to the wider reputation and concept of heat networks as a system for decarbonising the rest of our borough. This is against the backdrop of the wider sector not having a great reputation locally. And these negative narratives are counterproductive to what we want to achieve strategically across our borough. So as you know from before, the provider was not supplying affordable and reliable heat to our residents. So consequentially, if local politicians see heat networks as a threat to their voting base because of this situation, then this is likely to impact us in the Fuse team because there will be a drop in political support for what we are trying to achieve with heat networks more widely. So rather than waiting for the issue to filter through from the residents up to the local politicians, I proactively organised a meeting with the new provider to get their view on why the situation has developed and what they were doing about it. I also met the estate owner, who has the heat obligation, to get their perspective on the situation too. Then I met with our lead member to brief them of the situation. But what this meant was that I could then help shape the narrative to them that fairly represents the reasons behind the situation happening before others got the chance to do so, perhaps unfairly. In particular, I wanted to show that this was fundamentally not the fault of heat networks as a concept, but is actually a historic issue arising from a lack of regulation, and that the future will hopefully be very different with the new mandatory requirements coming in shortly that I've spoken about. So our lead member was happy with the briefing. It meant that my team was able to guard against looking like we're on the back foot, promoting heat networks more widely, and it retained a more positive narrative around the concept of heat networks, maximizing the likelihood of continued support for heat networks from our local politicians. It was also really helpful too, because it actually gives our lead member the ammunition to be able to rebut unsupportive arguments that he might have across the rest of the administration that he might encounter as a result of this episode. Actually, before I come to the conclusion, so I'll actually take questions on this as well, or maybe I'll just wrap it up actually, and then we can go to a Q&A. So as you've seen, I have used the vehicle of heat networks to convey to you my learnings for today around enhancing an understanding of stakeholders as part of a system. I've spoken about being outcomes led, being empathetic to stakeholders, and being proactive to dealing with conflict.